It's time to accelerate. Hi, I'm your host, Andy Paul. Join me as I host conversations with the leading experts in sales, marketing, sales automation, sales process, leadership, management, training, coaching, any resource that I believe to help you accelerate the growth of your sales, your business, and most importantly, you. Good morning and welcome to my show. Today my guest is Todd Schnick, founder and CEO of IntrepidNow Media, a burgeoning media empire, right?
I'm happy for you to say that, Andy, yes.
And so Todd, rather than have me introduce you, why don't you take a minute, introduce yourself to the audience, tell us what you do and who you do it for.
Yeah, well, Andy, thanks for having me on the show. I appreciate it. I'm a marketing, sales, and media strategist, if you will. I do some talk radio hosting and producing, and I also publish, as you said, Intrepid Now, which is a media platform that publishes interviews and articles on business, healthcare, and lifestyle. And we work with our clients and sponsors to strategically create media that they can. And that's either audio, video, or both. And we, with that, we help them achieve three things. One is that we create content that educates and moves their market, and they can integrate that content into their sales and marketing flow. We facilitate an environment where our sponsors can connect to prospects. So it's a bold, new, interesting way to achieve business development. And obviously, the final piece of what we do is we help our clients connect to influencers in their market vertical, which is a great way for them to expand and grow their business.
Well, tell us what you do in terms of the business development. That was interesting.
Yeah, well, I stumbled upon a strategy several years ago. I was doing a podcast, and I had no strategy, no real objective with it. It was just something I was experimenting with. This is probably dates back to 2008, 2009 timeframe. And I was doing some consulting at the time. If you recall the time frame, 2008, the economy was really struggling. So there were a lot of people out of work, and a lot of them tried to earn a living by going into consulting. And so I started consulting consultants and stumbled upon this strategy where we used this podcast we were messing around with, and we started inviting all these consultants onto our show as a way to kind of shine a light on what they were trying to do and go into market as a consultant themselves, and to give them a vehicle by which they could tell their story and get exposure out into a wider world. And inviting all these consultants onto our show, these all turned out to be prospects for us. And getting that face time on the podcast with them was a great way, for a very non-threatening, very easy way for us to get a lot of attention of people who were business prospects for us. And so it worked, and suddenly we have more business than we can handle. And so we thought, boy, there's got to be a way to leverage this same idea, this same model, and help other people leverage a podcast as a business development strategy. And so that's when we formed a company. And gosh, 7-8 years later, we're still going strong and having a great time doing it. How that manifests itself is it's a very simple model, actually, Andy. I mean, if you host a radio show or a podcast in whatever space or vertical you're in, whether it's business or consulting or healthcare technology or whatever it is, you host this show and you identify organizations that you want to connect with and market to them. And so instead of doing a cold call, trying to get their attention and pitching them, what I do instead is I invite them onto my show, and I get to know them. They're happy to talk to me because it's a great way for them to get exposure. And once that interview's done, I formed a new friend, right? I have a relationship now. All the books say you got to develop rapport. Well, there's no better way to do that than to interview someone on a radio show. And so once that conversation's done, my relationship with them is at an entirely different level. And now it's so much easier to transition into the real conversation I want to have, which is a business development one.
Right.
So we do a lot of regular shows.
I think that's just a great piece of advice for people that are listening, that if you want to, a great business development tip, right, is use a podcast, because it's a great way to create content, as you said, in general, but then invite people that you want to be prospects as guests to the show. I mean, it's a fantastic idea. And I think for people who are listening, something they should take note of for sure.
Yeah, well, that's the only way I go to market now, Andy. I've been doing it that way for 7-8 years.
Yeah, perfect. I love it. So I want to sort of change gears. I want to, we obviously, the theme of the show is we're talking about sales, marketing, acceleration. And so to sort of change it up a little bit, I want to talk about politics, sort of. So
The third rail of podcasting.
the third rail of podcasting, politics. But you were in politics for a long time, right?
Oh yeah, have probably a 10 to 15 year career in politics
All right.
before I got into business.
And you weren't the candidate, you weren't the office holder, you were the person running behind the scenes. So I want to talk about how politics and sales sort of mesh, right? I mean, the lessons we can learn about sales from politics, from selling a candidate, from selling a platform, and so on. So tell us about the jobs you did in politics first.
Well, the first job out of school was as an aide to a congressman. So I did that for about 3 years and ran the district operation. Then I ended up getting into party politics, and so worked at the Republican Party of Florida for, probably 5 years, 6 years. That culminated in working on the Florida presidential race in 2000. Of course, we all know what happened with the Florida recount.
Hanging Chad.
Oh, yeah. So it was knee deep in that. In fact, if you Google me, you'll probably find a lot of my testimony from a lot of those court cases when Al Gore sued me. But then after Florida, like I said, I was there for about 5 years. I went out west and was the executive director of the Nevada Republican Party, and then was quickly recruited to Georgia, where I became the executive director of the Georgia Republican Party, and had a very successful election there. That was the 2002 election cycle, and that's where we elected the first ever Republican governor in Georgia, elected the first ever Republican control of the state Senate, and also defeated an incumbent Democratic U.S. senator. So we had a very, very good year, 2002. Like most selfish young men, I chased the money and tried to lobby for a while, and did not really enjoy that line of work too much, and so got into political consulting, and then did that for probably 5 years. But Andy, that's where the transition started happening. Once I started doing the consulting, I was working with a lot of amazing people doing amazing things, and started doing more and more consulting for their business. And that's when I got the bug on doing the marketing consulting, and transitioned out of my political career.
So it seems like to me that campaigns, they're relatively short affairs, right? Compared to, let's say, to the life cycle of a product.
Right.
So you're really faced with this process, sort of compressing the sales process into a relatively short period of time, right? You might have a 3 to 5 month campaign or 6 month campaign, let's say, including primaries for a state office. Yeah, how do you accelerate that sort of positioning of the candidate and establishing a value proposition that you can clearly communicate in a relatively short period of time, and also mostly through indirect messaging as opposed to out knocking on doors all the time, talking to people face to face?
Yeah, well, gosh, Andy, this is a conversation that could take us 4 hours. I mean, it's you threw out a whole bunch of stuff there. It's funny when I transitioned away from politics. People said, "Well, you've never been in marketing, you've never been in sales," and I was like, "What do you think I did for 15 years? I was selling candidates, I was selling ideas, I was selling a message." So but you're right. There is a tight window. I mean, all campaigns. Of course, if you're watching the presidential race for 2016, it seemingly is never ending.
Right.
But there is an end point on the campaign, right? And so there is an election day, and so there's one day where people go and buy or don't buy, right? So it is very much a compact system. Now, unfortunately, one of the things that a lot of people find distasteful in politics is this need to raise a lot of money, right? And people find that very frustrating, that it's all about fundraising. Well, part of the reason you have to do that is that you do have to communicate a message. You do have to identify an audience that's going to be receptive to your message, and so you do unfortunately have to raise a lot of money, and that's part of the strategy, Andy, by which you deal with that compressed time frame. Because if you make a decision to run for office, well, then you have to get up and running very, very quickly. And there's things you have to do to run successfully. Is you have to recruit and identify voters who are going to vote for you on election day, which is, quote, the buyer of your product, if you will. You have to put a lot of money out there to put out television commercials and send out direct mail to communicate to those voters. And so, I mean, it's a frustrating answer to your question, because I wish there was a different way to do it. But the fact is, you have to raise a lot of money. That's one of the reasons why these campaigns have to do that, is that they have to get a message out there very, very quickly.
Well, let's break it down. So
and you're starting with a new product, you're going to have like a use case, and around the use case, you're going to build a value proposition for an ideal customer. So what's the process in politics to develop that value proposition? I mean, how do you just sit down with the candidate? Do you test it? I mean, how do you do it? And what are the lessons back for, small, medium-sized enterprise that's getting ready to launch a new product?
Well, the first thing you have to understand is, all right, who is going to be voting in this particular election? And I'm not talking about a national presidential election. Let's talk about
use one of yours as an example.
Yeah, well, so a race for Congress, right, or for a state legislature, which is in a confined geographical district. So you have to understand the voters in that district. You have to say, all right, do they lean conservative? Are they liberal? Is there a big independent streak where there's more moderate voters there? You have to assess that electorate to really understand what message will resonate with them, right? So if you're in a very liberal district, well, a conservative candidate's probably not going to do very well there. And so you have to make the decision, is this even a worthwhile endeavor? It's no different than if you, all right, does your product have the right market fit? I mean, it's the same principle there. And so, yeah, a lot of how you do that, Andy, is you survey that electorate. We're all familiar with polling. Mm-hmm. And every day when we're watching the news, we see the latest polls and all that. Well, yeah, typically the poll you see when you're watching the news is a head-to-head. All right, Hillary versus Bush. Where does that stack up? But what the main crux, what most of the work done with polling isn't necessarily a head-to-head. A head-to-head matchup on a poll is just a snapshot of where people stand on a race in that time and place. What the real work of polling does is really dive down deeply into the details of the issues and what do people care about? Are they passionate about these? What issues move people? What issues are people caring about in this particular election? In this particular district, there's 435 districts in Congress. Every one of them is different in a lot of ways because there's local nuance to the election. So you have to go in there and understand that. And you mentioned knocking on doors. I mean, there really isn't a better way, Andy, to get out there and really get your pulse on what the people are thinking about than doing that. And that's something that I always worked very hard with my campaigns, was to get out there and actually interact with that voter. Polling is great. You can get a good sense of what people are thinking about, what they care about, but you've really got to look them in the eye, shake their hand, and that's when you really get to see what people are thinking about and what they're passionate about. And so that's generally how I always got my campaigns going. I did a very, very unfortunately, very expensive polling process to really get a quick snapshot of where people stood on the issues, what they cared about, things they were excited about, things they were disappointed in. And then once you get all that data back, then you can begin to articulate a strategy and figure out, all right, how do we communicate this and by what means do we communicate that? And then obviously part of the difference between selling a product and selling a candidate is that your candidate's opposing someone, right? And so you have to figure out what's the mix of my messaging of pro the issues I care about and what I think the people who are going to vote for me care about versus what are the issues that my opponent is supporting that I can put out a messaging that then says, all right, I don't like this issue because this candidate's supporting it, and so then I'm going to vote for the other guy. And so every decision you make has some sort of impact on how people perceive the opponent.
Right, but take it back to the case of relate it back to a business. You're coming out with a new product or you're thinking about a new product there's a sort of, I don't know, bifurcation in the way people sort of look at it. Some people say, hey, if you got a great idea, just run with it, come up with the product, then we find the market for it. Others say, hey, we need to be doing some research. We need to find out if we can really identify, like I said, the ideal candidate or ideal prospect for this and the ideal market for it. And so politics is obviously much more the latter than the former, though.
Right.
Though I imagine, though, that you probably ran across politicians at some point in your career who were a little bit more of the former, that really just had a desire to be in office and perhaps had less of a platform?
Yeah, of course. Every election, there is someone who runs, and just like you and I occasionally come across a business that has not done its homework and understanding if there's a product market fit. There's a candidate for office who runs in the district is not a really good fit for the kinds of things that he or she believes in. It's the example of a conservative running in a liberal district, right? It's just not going to work. And you have to spend a lot of money in the campaign if the goal is to really try to sway the political environment. I have always found that the approach to a successful election victory was to identify the voters who cared about specific messaging, and then I target those voters with messaging from my candidate that is in alignment with how that voter is thinking. Now, it's a lot harder to convince someone to change, right? You're not going to convince a conservative to vote for a liberal and vice versa. So the strategy is I have to find as many conservative voters as I can and identify them, be sure that they are favorable towards my candidate. And if they're not favorable, then I'm not going to contact them anymore. I may try to decide, is there any ability to convince them to vote for my guy? But oftentimes that's a lot of work. That's expensive work to convince someone to change their mind. So the real simple math there is identify people who support my candidate and his or her ideas, get them on a list, and then the hard work is then turning them out to vote on election day. And if I get one more vote than my opponent, then I win.
Right. So to that point, and we'll talk about more after the break, is how do you handle objections in that environment? Right. And then the second issue I wanted to get back to before is because I think that similar to the way new companies you see that succeed is they're driven by a passion, right? Somebody's got a passion for what they're doing, a passion for the product or the market they're serving, the service they provide. They tend to be the ones that are most successful in the long run.
Yeah,
and you need that. I think in politics you certainly see that right now. We see with we're talking in 2015 and the ever burgeoning mass of candidates declaring for the Republican nomination. There clearly are some that don't seem to have the passion for governance as much as, or for a specific issue as much as just wanting to be in the limelight, it seems like, right?
Yeah, well, on the day that we record this, the 16th candidate for the Republican nomination has announced. So it's quite a big field. And yeah, I mean, having been an observer of politics for a long time, Andy, in fact, I know probably half the candidates that are running. Used to work for Jeb Bush, so and know Marco and all that. So and I can tell you that a lot of these. And I'm obviously much more familiar with the Republican side than I am the Democratic side, and so that's not why I'm commenting much on the candidates running for the Democratic nomination. It's a different kind of a race. A lot of them are very driven to affect change. They have a passion for the country, and they want to lend their mark on affecting positive change and moving the country forward. But certainly in the Republican field, certainly in the Democratic field, at all levels, from president on down to city council, there are people who have a passion to be an elected official. They don't necessarily aren't driven by issues. They aren't driven by affecting policy. There are many people who run for office that are just enthralled with the idea of being an elected official and like the idea of having a title of congressman or councilman or representative. And so there are certainly people who run for office who aren't necessarily motivated by a particular issue. They may have a guiding philosophy. They may have a conservative philosophy, or they may have a libertarian philosophy, or they may have a liberal philosophy. I mean, that generally informs and governs their position on most issues, but they're not necessarily running for office because they want to enact a very specific law.
Right.
They're in it more to be someone, to be important, to have a position of influence, and maybe their motivation is more to just be a supporter of their philosophy of government.
Right. And I'd say that in most cases, if you're starting a business, an entrepreneur, and your primary goal is I want to be rich, you're not going to be as successful as somebody that says, I've got a passion for, this particular product, or I said serving this particular market, and in doing so, they ultimately find a way to
and you have to.
That.
Yeah, and here's the other thing that passion impacts in politics is you have to recall. And you have to understand that come election day, there is not a 100% participation amongst all eligible voters, right? So there is, unfortunately, millions of Americans who on election day never turn out to vote. And that's frustrating. And I wish that wasn't the case, but it is the case. And so you have to factor that into your thinking when you're orchestrating a strategy for a political campaign, is because you can assume a presidential election is obviously a little bit different because there's more coverage of it and there's more interest in it. But the more local your race gets, the less interest in the public has in participating in that election. And that's very much a factor in your strategy. Is all right, there's probably in some cases 50 to 60 to sometimes even 70% of the electorate is not going to participate in an election. And so you have to figure out who those people are and not waste your time talking to them. Well, it's the same idea in business, right? I mean, you may put out a product, you may put out a service, and it's not for everyone. Right. And in fact, if you try to make a product that's for everyone, you're probably going to fail because there's just no way that's possible. It's no different in politics,
so
right?
Segmenting your market, very important.
Yep.
All right. Well, good. We're going to come back after the break and talk more with Todd Schnick about sales, politics, more sales stuff. And this is Andy Paul. We'll be right back.
Hi, this is Andy. Connect and Sell is used by sales reps at nearly 1,000 companies, including hundreds of technology startups and several Fortune 500 companies, to overcome the challenges of getting prospects on the phone. Companies using Connect and Sell grow their revenues faster by enabling their sales reps to have more sales conversations in 90 minutes than they could otherwise achieve in an entire week. Connect and Sell can be deployed directly to your sales reps, or you can take advantage of their outbound on-demand service, which delivers qualified prospect meetings scheduled directly on your sales reps' calendars. Visit connectandsell.com to learn more about how Connect and Sell can start filling your pipeline today.
Welcome back. My guest today is Todd Schnick. You can catch Todd online at intrepidnow.com and learn about the variety of things that he has got going on in his burgeoning media empire. And so I did want to get back to one more thing that we had talked about prior to the break, which is this whole issue of objections and sort of nurturing prospects, right? Because you're pretty clear stating that, hey, we do fairly in-depth research. We identify very precisely the types of voters, if not the actual voters, that we're going to spend our time trying to convince because we think they're high likelihood to vote for us. You need to do the same in business, right?
Absolutely. No, it's critical, and that's work that a lot of organizations I've come across, Andy, just don't do. They don't do that deep homework. They assume if I build it, they'll come. And very, very, very rarely does that strategy work. So it's no different in politics. I mean, so you really do have to understand what motivates people to get out and vote. You really have to understand what motivates people to go out and buy a product. It's very similar thinking. They're making an investment in something that they think is important to them, that excites them, that solves a problem for them. Sometimes people vote for candidates because the candidate says, "I'm going to fix some problems." Our city streets need to be paved, and so you will support a local city council candidate who pledges to pave the streets. I mean, so you make your decisions based on how it's going to impact your life, and it's the same thinking, the same philosophy that goes into understanding how people buy your product or service.
Right. And the point you're making is that sometimes objections, and this is like sort of one of my things I get up on my soapbox about is so much effort and written about in sales in terms of overcoming objections, and sometimes objections just aren't meant to be handled, right? So I mean, you've got some people that you can spend as much time as you want, and you're just not really ever going to change their mind. So
yeah, Andy, it's a great point.
Why do that?
Yeah, it's a great point. In fact, you've made me think about something that I've never really thought about before, and it's in my approach to sales, right? I mean, so when you are pitching a prospect and you're trying to convince them to buy, and they throw up some sort of an objection or concern, and the big question is, all right, how do you tackle that, right? That's in essence what you're trying to get at with this line of questioning, and I've always been very quick that if I have to do an awful lot of battling to get someone convinced to vote for my candidate or buy my product or service, I don't have time to do that. And maybe that comes from my political career where, as I said a few minutes ago, a big part of the work you do in a campaign is identifying those that are not going to support you, and so that you don't waste time with them. And maybe that's how my philosophy towards if I'm talking to a prospect and there's a lot of objections there, and I ascertain that it's going to require a lot of time, perhaps some money, and a lot of work to convince them. Otherwise, I don't have time to do that. There's plenty of other quote voters out there that I can identify who may be supportive of my candidate or of my product. And so I think you made me think on something here that I've never really thought about, but maybe my philosophy of being very quick to move past a prospect who is objecting a lot is not someone that I'm going to spend a lot of time with, because there's plenty of other people out there who are interested in buying, and I want to spend my time talking to them, helping them. I think there's also levels of objection, right? There's someone who says, well, I'm just concerned about one quick thing here, and then I can deal with that. But if they're fundamentally dug in, and it's going to take an awful lot of time to convince them. Otherwise, I don't have that kind of time. And I'm never going to convince a liberal Democrat to vote for a conservative candidate. I'm never going to do it. And if I tried to, my campaign philosophy was to try to convince every liberal to vote Republican, I would fail miserably. And so I think that's a philosophy that I've always brought into my business is that if someone's not necessarily easily going to be on board, then I'm going to move past and get on and identify and connect with people who are more likely buyers.
Yeah, it's a big world out there. And so often the training you get in sales training these days is, hey, it's like objections become personal battles, right? It's a personal challenge. Somebody's objecting, gosh darn it, we got to double down and sell harder in order to get this person back into the fold. And really, for people that are listening, it's really the opposite. As Todd has said, taking the example from politics, you're just not going to change minds that quickly. If it's something substantive, identify quickly whether it is substantive, move on. As I said, big world, lots of prospects out there.
And Andy, obviously, the position you take on this is informed by what you're selling, right? If you're selling a small consumer product, that's different than a giant enterprise complex sale, right? I mean, there's apples and oranges here, but because a complex sale is a whole different animal than trying to convince a consumer public to buy product. So you got to, obviously you have to factor that in. So, that's the point that we're talking about here is this idea that don't dig your heels in, don't waste time and money and resources trying to convince someone who's not going to be convinced. And I think a successful salesperson is someone who has the ability to read that and get a sense and from instinct say, this is going to be a battle to convince this person to buy. I have limited time and resources. I'm going to spend that time and resource on people who are more likely buyers.
Yeah, and as you talked about, or back early on, as you are identifying people that weren't going to vote for you, same thing is true in sales. Is instead of thinking about everybody as somebody that you need to qualify, start by disqualifying prospects or potential prospects that are not ever going to be prospects. Get them out of your pipeline, get them out of your life. Focus on the people that are going to buy.
Get them out of your pipeline. I'm a big advocate of keeping that pipeline really, really clear. And there are people who, someone says, yeah, I'm not ready to buy now. Come back to me in 6 months. Well, maybe I'll set them aside and reach out to them in 6 months. But oftentimes, if someone's not going to buy now, chances are, in my experience, they're never going to buy. And so I'm much more apt to move on and fill that pipeline with people who I know have a legitimate interest.
Yeah, and a more immediate interest. Okay, good. Well, let's move on to the last part of our show here. I'm going to ask you some questions, rapid-fire questions. You can give me one-word answers, or you can elaborate a little bit. But you ready?
I'm ready.
Okay, so what's the most powerful sales tool in your arsenal?
My podcast. I identify people I want to connect with and sell to, and I invite them on my show, and that's how I form my relationship with them, which then can lead to a business opportunity.
Name one tool you use for sales or sales management that you can't live without.
I use a tool called HighRise, which is a product of 37 Signals, and it's how I manage my opportunities.
Okay. Who's your sales role model?
Who's my sales role model? Good. That's a difficult question because there's so many people that I look up to, and it's not someone. It's not a popular sales.
Sure. Just name one.
I'm trying. You caught me off guard with this one. Let me think. I think my sales role model in this, and I'll choose. I have several. I'll choose this one because it's kind of apropos for the conversation today. But it's Ronald Reagan, and it's someone who believed very passionately about a cause, about a philosophy, and and never wavered from it, and always had belief, and never had to try to explain where he was coming from because he just believed it so to his core, and it made him a very successful politician because you always knew where he stood. Well, it's the same thing with the salesman and a product. You have to believe in what you're selling, because if you don't, then that's going to shine through, and people will not rally behind you.
Okay. Good answer. What's the one book that every salesperson should read?
What's one book that every salesperson should read? Let me think for a minute. Gosh, boy.
Yeah.
Interesting question. Let me think. Guys, you know I'm a big voracious reader, and so I have a lot of books that inform me. There's a book called The Obstacle is the Way. It's by Ryan Holiday. And it is not a sales book. It's not even, frankly, a business book, but it's a book about how, and it kind of speaks to our conversation around objections, because it may even sound contradictory to what we talked about with objections. But the goal, the mission of the book is to say, hey, the obstacle is actually where you need to go, because that's the problem you need to solve, and don't be afraid of solving that problem, because if you can, well, then everything flows from there. So that's a book that I always recommend to people, and always throws them. Well, this isn't a sales book, but it's a book about mindset and how to be fearless and to head towards the problem, not to run away from them.
Well, I think it's a great way to identify your ideal customer. So there you go.
Absolutely.
All right. Favorite music to listen to psych yourself up for a sales call?
Would you believe it? It would be classic jazz. It would be Miles Davis, Sonny Rollins, John Coltrane. Not exactly motivational music, but it puts me into a mindset of calm and relaxation, which is how I want to approach my prospects. I don't ever want to come across as needy and desperate, and so jazz is kind of how I ground my soul and get calm, and my humanity comes out, and then I'm really who I am when I'm talking to these prospects. So jazz is what I listen to.
Okay. What's the first sales activity you do every day?
First sales activity I do every day. Well, this will come as no surprise to you, Andy, but first sales thing I do every day is identify new guests for my show, because this is how I prospect. And so I do a lot of reading. I follow the news. I pay a lot of attention to organizations doing interesting things, because then that's how I make my connect to a prospect. As I say, here's a company that I can help. They're just talked about something very, very interesting, and so I want to get them on my show to talk about that very thing. Boom! That's how I form my relationship. So my first goal every day is to recruit for my radio show, because that's how I prospect.
What do you do to keep fit and healthy?
I am a distance runner, so I jog about a 5K about every other day.
All right. Do you compete?
Do I compete in races? On occasion. I enjoy the solitude of running, and so I enjoy that peace and quiet and alone time. It's sort of like active meditation, if you will. So the races are exciting and fun, but I don't compete in many of those anymore.
All right. So last question then is, the one question you get asked most frequently by salespeople is,
how in the heck do you use a podcast for sales? So many people are because I'm convinced that every salesperson ought to be doing something like this. They ought to be creating a podcast. It's so easy. It's so simple. It's so popular and hot right now. But the biggest question is, how in the heck they can't get their head around it and don't understand how it just completely changes your approach to sales. And so that's the biggest question I get.
Right. In fact, they could, salesperson, sales manager, so on. I mean, they could actually do this just starting on a lower level with just like a blog, right? And call somebody up, a potential prospect, and say, how we want to interview you for our blog.
Yeah, it doesn't have to be an audio interview, Andy. You're absolutely right. I think a blog, and you reach out to someone and say, I want to showcase you on my blog, and I'll send you you can even have a pre-formatted questionnaire. Here's the questions that I'd love for you to answer. And just look, what's the real secret here? The interview you get isn't isn't the magic sauce here, right? The content you create, yeah, while it can be great and utilized and shared, that isn't why you're really doing this. What you're really doing by inviting someone to participate on some sort of an interview, whether it's a written interview, whether it's an audio podcast, whether it's a video interview that you would publish on YouTube, the real secret here is hosting such a vehicle that showcases and shines a light on someone, gives you the ability to reach out in a non-threatening way and invite them to participate. That's the secret. That is the secret, to have an obvious excuse to call someone and say, hey, I'm fascinated by you and I want to get you on my show. Boom. That's so much easier than cold calling someone you don't know and saying, hello, can I get 15 minutes of your time so I can express to you how I can reduce costs and improve efficiencies. That's so much harder. And when you invite someone to participate on a media program like a podcast, you can do that with people you don't know. Yeah. You can say, I have just been paying attention and monitoring what you guys are doing and just fascinated. Would love to share your story to my audience. That's something that's an easy call to make versus your more traditional, typical cold call, sales call. So that's the real power of this whole idea. It isn't conducting the interview. Yeah, sure, you get to know someone very well.
It's making the relationship. Absolutely.
But it's the easy way to connect to someone, to invite them to participate. That's the true secret of this.
Great advice for everybody listening. So I want to thank my guest today, Todd Schnick. Todd, how can people learn more about you?
They can go to IntrepidNow.com. That's the easiest way to find me.
All right. It's a great website. A lot of great things going on there. Again, I want to thank Todd again for joining us. And remember, if you want to accelerate your sales and amp up your business, then you need to deliberately learn something new every day that will empower you to achieve your goals. And I think we helped with that today, Todd. So until next time, good selling, everyone.
Hi, this is Andy. I have a special offer for loyal listeners of Accelerate. It's a no-obligation free trial of my zero-time selling interactive online training. Now, I've worked with thousands of sales reps to teach them how to use my zero-time selling to boost their productivity and transform the results. And so if you want to learn the same proven strategies to help you open more doors, have more effective sales conversations with prospects, and close more orders, then my zero-time selling interactive training system is a fit for you. It's incredibly simple to start. Just take out your smartphone and text the word TRUST, that's T-R-U-S-T, to 96,000. Now, do you have your phone ready? You're going to send a text to 96000. That's a 9 and a 6 followed by 3 zeros. Now enter the single word message TRUST and hit send, and you hear right back from me with instructions on how to sign up for your free trial on my zero-time selling interactive training. I look forward to seeing you there. Thanks for listening to the show. If you like what you heard and want to make sure you don't miss any upcoming episodes, please subscribe to this podcast on iTunes or Stitcher.com. For more information about today's guest, visit my website at andypaul.com.